Inevitably, when I teach this class, kangaroos comes out as the largest thing that people think about with this region. So definitely having different animals that are fairly charismatic catches people's attention. You have the idea of the area being beautiful, warm, isolated, things like that, exotic. The Lord of the Rings often shows up because it was filmed in New Zealand. Accents, which of course everyone has an accent, but because most of the people who take this class are English speakers, we definitely recognize those English accents when we hear them from other parts of the world. So these are some of the things that folks think about with this part of the world. So just to kind of give an overview, we are talking about a very vast area here, and as you can see, the majority of it really being ocean that makes up this area. So it's a very sea-focused region. So we can think about it as oriented towards the Pacific and fairly isolated, because we're talking about very, very long distances. So for example, some of the islands that are out in the middle of Melanesia might be a 7-hour plane ride to Australia and another 7 hours the other direction to places like Hawaii. So really vast, vast distances for this part of the world. So in a sense, a lot of these South Pacific islands and even Australia and New Zealand you can think of as somewhat isolated from the rest of the world because of these extreme distances. It's a relatively low population for the region overall, only 31 million people for the entire world region. So, very, very much less than some of the other world regions that we've talked about. And we have, many, many, many islands of the small islands in the Pacific, and those are kind of grouped into 3 island regions: Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. And have fun with those on your map quizzes. I know I always struggle with those myself, but now you'll know where some of them are located. If we think about the landforms in the region, there's a couple of different types of things that we see. On Australia, you have a continental plate, and so you have very little orographic or orogenic activity, so not a lot of earthquakes, things like that. You can divide the continent into 3 main regions. You have a kind of mountain range along the eastern side of the continent, so the Great Dividing Range, lowlands in the interior, and a western plateau. If you think about where Australia sits in terms of latitude, it's in one of those areas where there's constant high pressure that's set up. So around 20 degrees north and south, we see that. And so you have a lot of desert. The majority of Australia as really being extremely hot desert environments. And we often think about that when we think of the outback of Australia as very remote, low population densities, not a lot of rainfall. Much of this land is used for things like grazing cattle, but over vast areas where there might not be a lot of grass that grows, but because you have such a large area, it's able to be efficient enough to graze cattle. A lot of mining that takes place here as well. One of the iconic images that we think of with Australia is Ayers Rock, which you see here with some camels in front of it. It's a major tourist site, but it's also very sacred to the Aboriginal people who were the original inhabitants of Australia. Because the area is a desert location, it's prone to frequent droughts, wildfires, and those sorts of environmental hazards. If we look at the landforms on the Pacific Islands, you kind of have 2 different options in terms of what you see. The islands that are volcanic tend to have a sort of high peak, obviously that peak that's built up over time through that volcanic activity. And because of that peak, you get rainfall. We talked earlier in the quarter about the idea of orographic uplift. So when a wind hits some sort of obstacle, it goes up the side of that obstacle, it raises in altitude, the air cools, causing precipitation to form on the windward side of the obstacle, and then for it to be dry on the leeward side of the obstacle. So this is what you really see in the environments for Pacific Islands. So if you're ever traveling to a volcanic island that has a high peak, you might want to take into account which side you want to stay on, if you want a lot of daily rain or not. Some places it's very profound, the sort of difference you see between the two sides. The other dominant landform for the Pacific Islands are low islands that are basically coral atolls. These tend to be very dry and have low rainfalls overall. We can look at how atolls have formed over time. So originally you have a volcanic island that's formed, and around that develops a coral reef over time that's built up by activity there. Once the volcanic island starts to erode, you have that part disappear, but the coral remains. So these islands tend to be very low in altitude. Some of these places are only a couple meters above sea level, which make them very prone to climate change, which you'll see in the supplement or the video on Kiribati and climate change there. This world region is very interesting in terms of the plant and animal life that we find there. One of the subfields of geography that looks at the spatial arrangement of plants and animals is called biogeography. And so biogeographers are especially interested in this region. What you see in these places is what people have thought of as island biogeography. So the theory of island biogeography is that the diversity of the plants and animals that you find are going to increase the larger the island size that you have. So the bigger the island, the more diverse the plant and animal species. So you see that really in Australia, which is a very large island, and you have a lot of really incredible, unique animals that you don't see in other parts of the world. One of the reasons why you have such uniqueness is there's zoological boundaries that separate the Eurasian continent from Australia. You have very deep sea trenches that separate these areas, and people have theorized these zoological boundaries of Wallace's line and Weber's line. So you have animals and plants evolving independently in these two different areas, and that's one of the reasons you see such very different types of plants and animals. So because of this isolation of Australia from Eurasia, you have great diversity, over 20,000 different plants, 650 species of birds, 380 different sorts of reptiles, and marsupials and monotremes that you don't see in other parts of the world. You can really see that captured here in this crossing sign warning, where you have kangaroos, camels, and other types of animals that you wouldn't see in other parts of the world. The Great Barrier Reef is another really unique ecological area within this part of the world. It's been considered a World Heritage Site because of its extreme beauty and ecological importance. It's over 1,200 miles long and has 3,400 different reefs with 300 species of coral, 1,500 species of fish, and 4,000 types of mollusks. This is a really big boon for tourism and brings all kinds of folks in to dive and check out the reef to the tune of about $1 billion a year. The ecosystems that you find on the Pacific Islands are really built from plant and animal species that have somehow made their way to these isolated islands, either by birds traveling by air, or have washed up in the ocean, or traveled by ocean. The higher islands have rainforests because they tend to get that higher rainfall that we talked about earlier. They might have mangroves in the coastal regions. Some of the larger islands have mid-elevation grasslands, so you find that in places like the Big Island of Hawaii. The low islands are pretty dry and have very little vegetation overall, and there's really not a lot of mammals. It's mostly birds and marine animals that dominate the area.